Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be covering human development. So this topic is super high yield in terms of like the amount. It's one of the shortest topics that we cover in the syllabus, and also, in that sense, it's got a lot of marks available because there's not that much, and if you learn it well, then you've got quite a good chance of getting marks. So in terms of the syllabus, you'll probably have a copy of the syllabus hopefully with you, so you know what kind of things we're going to be covering today. So it's development, attachment theory, kind of parenting, that kind of thing, developmental aspects. As said, it's quite straightforward stuff, but it can just be a bit of a memorization kind of topic, which makes it a bit I wouldn't say boring, but it is a bit slow at times. So again, these are all things that we'll hopefully cover. So the key concepts, so we're going to be looking at the different theories that encompass development, as well as some of the important life events and the theories of those most important people. So Freud, Piaget, Kohlberg, Erikson, Klein, Mahler, and Ainsworth, as well as a couple of others as well. And then other things like puberty, which do come up as questions. So I just made this kind of timeline, I suppose, because I found it quite useful to conceptualize where the different theories actually fit into the lifespan. So many of the theories that are covered in this syllabus, particularly in this topic, they relate very much to the early years of development. So from birth to 1 year particularly, there's a lot of theories about development in that time, which you can imagine because that is the key time for, if you look at a baby compared to when it's born compared to 1 year, the amount of change that it goes through during that period of time, there's been so much that has been speculated about that time. But then again, like early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and there's quite a lot of things looking at the midlife as well, and going into old age. So it can just be useful to conceptualize it in this way, and I think this helped me also remembering the different aspects. So these are the developmental theories. So these cover the lifespan. So they're different from the theories of development from early on. Obviously, for example, with Freud's theory, it starts from zero, from birth, and all of these do really cover a lot of aspects of early life, but they actually cover the whole of the lifespan. So Freud's theory about psychosexual development relates to later life as well. Again, Erikson's theory, this is your psychosocial development. And then Piaget's got your cognitive development, how you develop from a child to becoming an adult. And then Kohlberg's theory is throughout the lifespan of developing like morality and personality as well. So we start with the king, who is very, very well known and very famous for this theory of psychosexual development. And I won't kind of bore you guys with it because I'm sure this is something that you've probably covered in teaching as well. But just to go through it a little bit, so oral stage, that's it's 0 to 1 years, but it can also be sort of 0 to 1.5, so to 18 months. So pleasure and needs of the baby are explored through sucking, swallowing, and biting. So you can imagine the interaction with the mother. And then the second phase is the anal phase, which is between around 1 year or 1.5 to 3 years. And this is through exploring bowel and bladder, so going to the toilet, the feeling of eliminating, and also retention as well. And then the phallic phase, which is 3 to 5 years. So during this phase, the boys pass through the Oedipal complex and girls through the Electra complex. And girls are said to develop penis envy at this stage, which was again one of Freud's contentious remarks, I suppose, and one thing that made him quite famous later. Latency stage is age 5 to 12 or to puberty, and this is a period where the sexual drive remains latent, so children are not kind of actively in any particular focus in terms of things, and then later, after they go into the genital phase, once puberty starts around 12 on average towards adulthood, so puberty to adulthood. So this is characterized by independence from parents, and they form intimate relationships with others, including sexual relationships. So this is pretty long, and I know that pretty much everyone has probably seen this before in questions. And if this is quite a, I think once you understand like what he's trying to say, trying to lay out, it does make sense. But I think in terms of memorizing it can be a bit tricky. So he spelled out these 8 stages of ego growth, and they're chronological phase specific crises, and they're kind of separated into these ego syntonic and ego dystonic options. So ego dystonic is something that is, not a good outcome, unpleasurable. So for example, in each crisis, you've got like trust or autonomy, initiative. You've got the kind of good aspect, which is if you complete that crisis or that stage successfully, you will have developed that thing. And then the other option is if you don't go through the crisis, if you don't pass the stage or the crisis, then you end up with the other option, which is becoming mistrustful. So ideally it says at each phase there's a cogwheeling, so there's a kind of connection between the last phase and the next phase, and the way that they interact with other people as well. So for example, when a child is born, they are developing this trust versus mistrust. So they are learning to trust their parent, the caregivers, the people around them, and this will come from the interactions of the parenting style, whether they're getting food, water, shelter, warmth, attention, all of the things that are needed. And I never really got what the point of like the virtue was in terms of hope, but I suppose like from my understanding of it, this is kind of like the summary overall characteristic that is developed in the personality, if this stage or crisis is fulfilled properly. So with trust, then the virtue of hope is achieved. And then secondly is autonomy versus shame. So this is when between the ages of about 1 to 3, the child is developing, it's going through the different stages of cognition, interaction with others, its attachment style. And autonomy comes from kind of developing the confidence in their own ability, learning kind of the basic things like how to crawl, how to walk. And this virtue comes down to will. I suppose that, again, I find that quite an interesting theory in terms of, I guess it's like the movement or the desire towards progression could be characterized as will. So maybe for the second one, you could imagine just them learning to walk and having that autonomy. Then the third is initiative versus guilt. So this is characterized between the age of 3 to 5 years. And this is kind of like that toddler stage where they're learning to develop confidence in themselves and taking initiative and trying new things and almost taking responsibility as well. So that comes down to the virtue or the characteristic in their personality, which is purpose. Then industry or competence versus inferiority. And this is a primary school period of time where this is built, and competence. So this can be developed in all sorts of ways, especially kind of like preschool to primary school, going to school, interacting with peers, learning to do things, actually achieving things. So, like putting in homework, getting marks back. So this develops competency and almost like a belief in the self that they are able to do things. So that's competence. Then identity versus role confusion. I feel this is quite easy to remember because it's the teenage years, so 12 to 19. This is understanding your own identity. And I'm pretty sure that most people, when they were a teenager or no teenagers, that, really struggle to understand like who they are in society, how they fit in, what their identity is, culturally, or from any kind of aspect really. So this is learning how they fit into society and understand their true self. And this develops the virtue of fidelity. Then the next stage is intimacy versus isolation. So if this is successfully managed, this psychosocial crisis or stage, This will develop the virtue of love, and this is around the age of 19 to 35. And I think really what Erikson meant in this is the kind of romantic love, really, because that is the correct probably age for initiation of romantic love. So learning how to have comfortable relationships, senses of commitment, safety and care. And failing this stage or crisis can lead to isolation and loneliness if they're unable to find a partner or to have relationships. I mean, I think this could also include like friendships and family as well. So after the period of learning a bit of identity and gaining some independence, you know, people do, not everyone, I suppose, has to be in a romantic relationship in order to kind of fulfill this aspect, but it is about relationships. Then generativity versus stagnation. This is the age between 35 to 65, and this is the virtue of care. And this is the feeling of people who've achieved something in their career, they're giving back to work, they're giving back to their families, they're rearing children, they're involving in community activities, and they're kind of enmeshed in their own community. So this is an important part of society. You know, it relies on people having this stage and being able to do that. And then the next one is integrity versus despair, and this is the last one. So this is from the age of 65 onwards, and this develops the virtue of wisdom. So a sense of integrity develops if we feel our life has been worthwhile, and despair if we are dissatisfied, and if successful, we develop wisdom. So it's kind of essentially a way of looking back at life and saying, was it good? Like, did I achieve what I wanted to? And this develops integrity as well. So Erikson, so one point to note is Erikson actually never defined a specific range of like ages. So the ages that are written in there are actually just academic estimations of what these periods of time are. So this is actually not part of his original theory. And again, according to him, the ego or the self develops as it resolves these crises and relies on being able to fulfill the previous stage in order to progress to the next one. Although you can progress to the next one, but that aspect or that virtue won't be developed. Again, this is the same theory, but I was just trying to think of some ways to kind of remember the stages. So I just wrote down a few kind of like very short mnemonics. I did try before when I was doing the exam to really think of a way, like a phrase to learn these, but I just ended up writing these out like TMH to try and just get that into my mind. But I do think it really helps kind of having an example for each. So like the autonomy, you know, trust, love, all those kind of things. Just maybe like drawing or writing them out in your own way. Okay, so again, just a couple more points on him, on this theory from Erikson. So these are kind of, this is a psychosocial developmental theory. So that's purely what it focuses on, whereas Freud was psychosexual. This relates to personality and character. And again, as I mentioned, the building on each stage, this is known as the epigenic principle. So that's something that is a good phrase to remember. Yeah, and as said, so this, if the stages or the crises are not solved, then that can result in an unhealthy sense of self, or that virtue not being realized, but that can also be resolved later as well. Okay, so now we move on to Piaget's theory, which I really like this picture of Piaget. I think he's really cute with his glasses and his hat. I think he looks like a very clever man. We will go into the theory of each section in more detail later. This is just covering the overall developmental theories, but we'll go down and break down into the circular reactions and those other things as well later on. But just starting off with the overall looking at this. So this is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So we've done psychosexual, we've done psychosocial, this is cognitive development. And what the important thing about Piaget's theory is he is really looking at how does the the baby or the child interact with the world and the environment around them to form an understanding of how the world works and how they can interact with the world. So that is essentially what he's talking about. How do we learn what how things work, essentially? So you've got these 4 different stages, which are sensory motor, when they first begin to interact and kind of playing with everything; pre-operational, when they're kind of understanding symbolism, and just kind of interacting at a slightly higher level; the concrete operational stage, and this is like primary school, end of primary school age, when they're just you kind of get the hang of understanding different things like size and measurements, that sort of thing. And then lastly, the formal operational, and that's the last thing. So this is when you become able to theorize and like deduce ideas, and we will go through this in more detail. And then the 4th very important developmental theory is Kohlberg. He thought of a theory of moral development, which will be broken down in the next slide. But basically, his theory is that morality is something that is learned through life, through different experiences. So there are different kind of theories of morality, but the one that the Royal College focuses on is, well, one of them is Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and this kind of outlines how people develop morality through their life and what they experience and how that shapes them. So this is how it is divided into. So you saw those 3 sections previously, so that was split into 0 to 9 years, around 9 to 20, and then 20 onwards. And then you can see like the pre-conventional level, conventional and post-conventional level. And these stages, I have another way of looking at it as well, which is on the next slide, but these stages, there's 6 of them, and they're divided 2 into each. And basically, if you think of them as the first 2 stages are quite basic, they're quite simple. When you think of a child and how they understand morality, it's not really that developed. It's kind of looking at not getting into trouble or getting a good thing, and that's the focus of it. And then at school age, so kind of 9 to 20, you're looking at not breaking rules, wondering what other people think of you, your role in the group, like not wanting to look bad in front of your peers. And so your morality is almost based on your external factors. It's not really an internalized thing yet. You're kind of saying, look, I want to do this thing, but I'm worried I might get into trouble. You're not really thinking, if it's right or wrong at this point. And then the last stage is the post-conventional level, which, as said, is from 20 and onwards, approximately. And this is when the person has developed a bit more. They've developed a sense of self. They've kind of thought about their identity a bit more, and they're understanding what morality means to them. And they're looking more at the spirit of the law, or understanding what is right and wrong, essentially. And that is the final stage. And actually, Kohlberg mentions that not everybody reaches this stage. And some people are kind of maybe stuck at stage 5 or even stage 4, and not really necessarily developing that moral framework or the moral understanding. Yeah, there's this other way of looking at it, which is the same 6 phases, but yeah, again, like I said, the times, the ages are approximate. So some places will say like to 9 years old, and some will say like to 7 years old. But I think I imagine it myself as primary school is pre-conventional, because you're thinking about like not getting into trouble, getting reward. I think of kind of secondary school, and sort of end of year 13 kind of age potentially as more conventional, and then after that maybe going to uni is more post-conventional. So yeah, so avoiding punishment, the first stage is like, taking toys away, so I'm trying to avoid that. Then self-interest is, no one's looking, quickly eat your sweet, that's self-interest, stage 2. Then good boy or good girl attitude is, if someone gives you a present and you don't really like it, you just pretend to like it because you don't want other people to think that you are ungrateful. And this is a good boy, good girl attitude. And then law and order morality is like at school, worrying about school rules. Then social contract is the next stage up, and that is saying, I understand that rules are there to help society, like I won't litter, but you do understand that there are exceptions to the rule. So, you know, like in an emergency, like if there was a car about to crash and you had to, I don't know why this would work, but you had to throw a piece of rubbish out the window to save someone's life, that would be acceptable in that social contract understanding. That is the worst example I've ever thought of. If anyone thinks of anything better, please message. And then the last one is kind of principle, and this is the highest level that you can reach, which is there's a moral rightness, and the right action is based on that, and that can be like imbibed into the self, into the sense of self. So again, just a couple of things with that. So Kohlberg was criticized because he did a study to develop this theory by using 72 boys who were each aged 10 to 16. So, and he presented them with a series of moral dilemmas. So the theory is criticized as being, firstly, only boys, so maybe potentially sexist. And then also like the age group is not particularly representative of like adulthood or younger childhood as well. But that is something to be aware of. So Levinson, he is famous for, and he's a bit more like recent actually. It's why we have pictures of him in color. So he was made famous or made popular for his book on the midlife transition. So he has a theory about life sequences and life points, and his is not part of the traditional developmental theory as such. His theory is not about development. His theory is mainly about kind of transitions between things. I suppose that is development in a way, but it's not necessarily formation of something. It's basically just the stages or the periods of life, and what happens in each of those, and you know, transitioning through those. So he basically has this life sequence theory, which is that, and his is different because his is age based, and that's the important thing. So his theory says that between these ages you should be doing this. You're early adult, then 2025 you're entering the adult world. Then age there's a transition. Then at age 12 you should be settling down. Then at age 40, so there's a couple of these cross-era transitional stages where basically he's saying like during these periods of around 5 years you're allowed to kind of be a bit more fluid or be a bit more flexible in your progress, because those are periods of transition. So the first one is the early adult one transition, which is from child to early adult. It's kind of around puberty. The second one is the midlife transition, which is around 40, which is when you go from early adulthood to middle adulthood. And then the last one is the late adult transition, which is a kind of around the retirement age of going from your working adult life to your late adult life, sort of retirement and getting older. And yeah, this is just his kind of way of looking at the life sequence. So now we're going to move on to language development. So there's a period of time called the pre-linguistic period, which if any of you like have babies or have had babies or have nieces and nephews or cousins and families who have a baby, you'll know that from 0 to 12, they don't really say any particular words as such. They might say like mama or papa, or like they might say their own name vaguely, but most of the noises that they make are kind of babbling, crying, laughing. They're generally just kind of noises. So this is a pre-linguistic period. So this is the time which is pre-established words. And then from age 12 months, they start this period called the holophrastic stage. And the holophrastic just means one phrase, and that is, or one word, and that is one word which has meaning. So they'll say like dog or cat, and they're usually quite simple words, but they can understand in this period basic instructions. And then from the 18 to 24 month age, they have around a 40 to 50 word vocabulary. So it does accelerate quite quickly. And they can use simple terms like play, eat, sleep, or like they know body parts often, so like head, foot. And they enter this phase called the telegraphic stage. And this is similar to, the reason it's called that is because it's like a telegram where you're trying to minimize the amount of words you're using. So they'll put like two words together, like more eat or now sleep or want play, like quite simple things. And that will be the telegraphic stage. And then 24 to 36 months, so that's sort of 2 to 3 years old, they will then develop 150 to 300 word vocabulary if they're in the if they're progressing and they're developing at the average normal rate. And they can combine words into quite simple sentences by this point, and can answer questions. But again, these are kind of phrases and things that maybe the parent will understand because they understand what words they know. And then at age 3 to 4, when they speak, they can use 3-word sentences, and strangers should be able to understand what they're saying. And they have a much higher vocabulary as well at that time, which is around 1,000 words. Okay, so these are the risk factors for delayed speech and language. So risk factor is male, childhood illness, which makes sense, if it affects their hearing or affects their kind of oral cavity, like if they like tonsils, adenoids, all of those kind of things. Young mother at birth, lower socioeconomic status, born late in the sibling order, so the youngest child or middle child potentially, lower maternal educational level, being a twin, and family history. So this is the most important, most reliable risk factor for delayed speech and language, which is that there's a family history. So Marcia, I thought Marcia was a lady before, but it's actually a guy called James Marcia. He developed this theory about identity formation, and he actually expanded on Erikson's theory. So he looked at Erikson's theory and really focused in on the identity formation period during adolescence. And looking at the kind of things like ideologies, occupation, religion, politics, and understanding a person, like developing themselves in terms of identity and who they are, how they fit into society. So he reports that he feels, in his theory, that identity development begins when individuals identify with role models who can kind of show them how they should be living or want to be living. And as identity development progresses, adolescents are expected to make choices within the confines of their social context. So within this framework that is sort of developed, these 4 sections, these are the kind of 4 outcomes that can occur, or the 4 separate statuses that Marcia identified. So he says that if someone has low exploration and high commitment, if they haven't explored much of like what other options are out there, like other religions or other kind of jobs or other backgrounds, if they don't really understand that the world has got so many different types of people in it, and they just already have decided who they're going to be, and they've decided they already want to be just a certain type of person, and they have a very high commitment to that, so they don't really want to change it, then that's called foreclosure, and that means they've kind of closed off themselves too early. They haven't necessarily developed a strong, they may have developed a strong sense of self, but they haven't really explored many kind of options and maybe will have a more narrow worldview. And then high exploration and high commitment. This is the ideal. So this is what we are aiming for. This is what teenagers, kind of best outcome would be, which is that they've explored a lot. So they've said, I've looked at Christianity and Buddhism and Islam, and I choose that I want to be Hindu because I've been brought up in that way, and I've thought about these other things. I'm very committed to it, and that is what I've decided. So they've got high exploration and they've got high commitment, and they want to keep that identity, and they have achieved that identity. And it can actually be something different. So they may have said, actually, I was born Muslim, but I actually prefer to be Jewish, and I've explored everything and this is what I've committed to. Or I was born in a very religious family and I've explored and I don't want to be, and I'm happy with that. And that is actually identity achievement. Not to say it can't change later, but this is the kind of original structure of it. And then having low exploration and low commitment, this is a difficult place to be in because this is identity diffusion. And they say that they haven't really explored much and they're kind of not really committed to who they are actually at that time. So they don't know what they want to do and they don't really have much focus or much interest in it. So they kind of have a low commitment and low exploration, which is identity diffusion. And then moratorium is a fair place to be in as an adolescent or during this process, which is that they're having high exploration. So they're really trying out different things, trying out who they want to be, looking at different occupations, different social groups or standings or religions, and they're thinking about what they want to do, but they haven't committed yet. So they've got low commitment and high exploration. And that is probably the step before identity achievement. So that is fine. Yeah, so I think that covers everything for that theory. Yeah, so just a point that it does develop self-confidence once they have done identity achievement. And in the other ones, if they don't get that far, it can be a bit, the self-confidence does not necessarily develop as strongly because the sense of self is not fully formed. Okay. So this is Margaret Mahler. She developed the separation individuation theory of child development, and she looks to me to be quite an old lady, I'd say. Like she looks very, very professorial and quite serious, I think. So she developed this theory, which is the separation individuation theory. And this is split into 3 different phases. So the first phase is the autistic phase. The second phase is a symbiotic phase. And the third is the separation individuals divided up into 4 different parts later. So in the, oh, sorry, someone just messaged. So in the autistic phase, which is 0 to 4 weeks, the child is cut off and spends all its time sleeping. So this isn't autism in the way that we think of autism, you know, as a developmental spectrum disorder. This is kind of basically saying that the child is cut off and they're just kind of like in their own world, essentially. The second phase, symbiotic. So this is when they are symbiotically joined mother. So they believe, well, if you can say they believe, but they feel themselves to be the same unit as them, as their mother. So them and their mother are not separate, they are together. So this is part of this theory that they are one thing. And then in the first subphase of stage 3, this is the first part where separation anxiety begins at around 6 to 10 months. And this is when the baby starts seeing themselves as an individual, as a separate entity from their mother. And this is, you know, this can be quite a difficult time because this is the first time they may experience anxiety of when their mother goes out of the room and starts crying. And then the second phase is practicing. So they're exploring connections with the world and people other than their mother, but they still need to have their mother in sight and have her there to know that they will be safe. Then rapprochement. I feel like this is a French word again, which I don't know, so I don't really know how to say it, but I can read it. So it's between 16 to 24 months, so kind of almost to a year and a half to 2. There is a resolving ambivalence between wanting to be close to their mother, but also wanting to have their own independence and, you know, develop that autonomy as an individual. So they're using things like transitional objects. So things like a teddy or like a blanket, like a comfort blanket. So they're using those to kind of almost soften the separation between them and their mother. And then at subphase 4, object constancy. This is when the separation anxiety starts to resolve, sort of age 3, where basically the child will understand that their mother will come back and she is a constant object. So she's not going to, you know, if she goes out of the room or if she's not in sight, she does exist as her own entity, and that is something that is constant as an object, and that means that the separation anxiety does reduce at this time. So now we're going to go on to the stages that Piaget mentioned in his cognitive development theory. So Piaget, as said, he did develop these 4 stages of development. And the first one is the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to around 2 years old. And this is the stage where they're trying to understand the world around them. They're interacting with things, and they are trying to basically they're basically trying to see what impact they have on the world and how the world impacts them. So things like initially from 0 to 2 months, you've only got the inborn reflexes. So grasping, sucking and looking. And then from 2 to 5 months, you've got some curiosity of the baby and primary circular reactions, which is, for example, sucking their thumb. So they will do something with their body. So primary circular reactions have to involve the infant's own body, and it will create something. So they'll suck their thumb and then they'll feel good. So they will keep doing that. And that's a primary circular reaction. Then from 5 to 9 months, they are basically developing these secondary circular reactions, which is that they interact with the environment and have an outcome. So they will shake a rattle. So they're picking up an object and shaking it, and they will get a noise from it. And that is a secondary circular reaction because they are seeking to change their environment and receiving a response from it. And then from 9 to 12 months is when they begin to understand object permanence. It's not fully formed at this point because they still have separation anxiety, for example, but they're starting to understand it. And this is why peekaboo works for children of that age between 9 to 12 months, because they believe that the person has completely disappeared when they are out of sight. And then when they return, it's like they have come out of nowhere, which is why it's so exciting for them. And then 12 to 18 months, these are tertiary circular reactions. So again, this is a child interacting with the environment. So maybe like they shake the rattle, it makes a noise. Maybe they shake something else and see what noise it makes. That's kind of the way a tertiary circular reaction works. And then 18 to 24 months, so a year and a half to 2 years. This is the period where symbolic representation and thought becomes evident, and they begin to show some level of reasoning, and object permanence starts to be more kind of developed at this time. Yeah, so just going over that again. The circular reactions are primary, so that involves only the baby's body. The secondary reactions, circular reactions, are involving an object such as shaking a rattle. And then the tertiary ones are experimentation with different things, but kind of a similar style. So like throwing on the floor, throwing a ball, then throwing a cup, then throwing a pen, then throwing a fork, or like things. That's a tertiary circular reaction. So the pre-operational stage is the stage after the sensory motor stage. So during the sensory motor stage, they're doing a lot more kind of like physical, like touching stuff, working out what stuff feels like, how they react to things, throwing things around. Whereas this stage is kind of a little bit more cognitively based. So this is around the ages of 2 to 7. They're starting to use a lot more symbols and language. They're still not logical, so they still can't like deduce rationality. Everything they say is technically illogical. May not be illogical, but what they say is not based on logical constructs. They use magical thinking, like phenomenalistic causality. So these are basically two things that are linked that actually are technically not linked, but they have ascribing to them. So there's a few examples that are quite common for like exam questions, like thunder causes lightning, or like it is dark outside because I am sleepy, or those kind of examples. And then they also have this thing called animistic thinking, which is when they ascribe life to objects. So, like, for example, we've got a piece of toast there. So they'll say, like, the fridge, feels pain, like if you punch it. They will do that kind of animistic thinking. And then semiotic function begins to develop at this stage, where they're able to use symbols to represent another meaning. Excuse me. So this is the concrete operational stage, and this is a concrete mixer to help you remember it. So this occurs between the ages of 7 to 11, and this is characterized by the child being sort of able to understand others' viewpoints at this stage. They still have not got completely logical thinking, but they have begun to logic, and they're able to do some syllogistic reasoning, which is forming logical conclusions from two premises. So, for example, all snakes are reptiles, all reptiles are cold-blooded, therefore all snakes are cold-blooded. They also develop the skill of conservation, which is when they realize that basically things like a cup of water, if you pour that cup of water into a bowl, it's still the same amount of water. So that's conservation. So objects can contain the same amount, even if they are in a different shape. And then the last one is reversibility. So understanding the relation between things. So, for example, ice can turn into water, water can turn back into ice. And then lastly, we've got the formal operational stage. The formal operational stage, this is from 11 to the end of adolescence. And this is the highest part of cognitive development from Piaget. And this is looking at the way that children develop the ability to test their hypothesis against reality. So they're using reasoning, they're using specific observations to form conclusions, and they're using general premises also to form specific conclusions as well. So this is hypothetico-deductive reasoning, so make sure you make a note of that.
These are other terms by Piaget, so they include schema, which is a category of knowledge and the process of obtaining that knowledge, mental structures used to organise that knowledge, assimilation, which is the process of taking new information into existing schema, and accommodation, which is changing a schema to accommodate new information. So these are just ways of understanding the world around you and how Piaget decided to categorise those aspects of knowledge and assimilation and understanding the world from a certain point of view. And talking about Klein's theory, so as soon as the baby is born, there's a fear of annihilation. And so this leads to a projection of both bad and good impulses, where the baby splits the external world into good and bad. And also this leads to kind of the way that the child sees the world as being one or the other, or black and white. So there's a famous example of the good breast and the bad breast, and this whole thing is known as the paranoid schizoid position. And then after around 6 months to a year, the child realizes that good and bad can come from the same object to the whole, and then this leads to the development of guilt, followed by the depressive position, where ambivalence is accepted. So you often see that, which we'll discuss later, in the personality disorders, one of the defense mechanisms is splitting, which is when people see things as either good or bad, kind of black and white. And this is well observed in kind of things like borderline personality disorder. So you may be familiar with this already. Now we're going to talk about the maturation tasks, which start from 0 to 6 months. So I've just made this kind of table with a memory aid to try and help remember it. I remember always that smiling is at 6 weeks. They also can recognise mum's face, so if you remember a mum's face that's smiling, that can be the memory aid for that. And then at 8 weeks, they make cooing noises, which is why I put a picture of a dove. So you know how doves make that cooing noise, like hoo hoo. So they kind of make that kind of noise, and they respond to noises and follow objects with their eyes. So it's a picture of a dove and an eye. So just remember, they make cooing noises and they follow objects with their eyes. At 3 months, they can hold their head up and they make noises called babbling, which is why I've got those bubbles there, and they make sound experiments, so they just kind of make noises with their mouth and try and make different experiments and hear what it sounds like. And then at 6 months they can do hand-to-hand transfer, which is that picture of the two hands. They've got palmar grasp and grasp things in their hand. They say dada and mama, and they can roll from their stomach to their back. So they can do a bit more complex maneuvers than just holding their head up, and they can just roll over and hand-to-hand transfer. So at 7 months they transfer objects between the hands, so they can pass from one to another and back to the same hand, and they do notice if they have dropped an object. At 9 months they can sit unsupported and they're able to crawl, and then at 12 months they have the ability to walk with the aid of furniture or cruising alongside, so they have their hand on the side of like the sofa, or they're holding the hand of like a parent, and they can walk doing that at 12 months. And then at 18 months they have the ability to use 10 to 20 words and also walk without help, ideally. So this is the time where they should be able to walk without help, so that would be 18 months. So these are just the memory aids. I hope they're useful to try and remember them. 2 years, so 2 to 3 word sentences. So if you remember 2 years, 2 to 3 word sentences. They can run and they can climb stairs without help. At 3 years they can feed themselves, count to 10, and they're able to dress themselves. And at 4 years they can copy a symbol, so they can draw a symbol on a piece of paper, like a cross or say a circle, and they can hop on one foot, which is why I've put a little rabbit in there. At 5 years they can skip and copy a triangle drawing. So I always find these really, really hard to remember just because it's pure memory, but that is just how it is. So we're just moving on to puberty now. So you can see there the difference between males and females. So the time when it begins is in the range, similar range, 9 to 14 or 8 to 14. Onset in the males is 12 and just younger in females is 11. And then you get all of those kind of other aspects like the pubertal growth spurt.
The pubertal growth spurt for height usually occurs between stages 3 to 4, Tanner stage of 3 to 4, and is completed by stage 5 in most males. And then for females, this should say begins in the range of 8 to 14 years old, and the mean age of onset is around 11. The breast development usually comes before the start of the first period by 2 years, and the first period occurs in Tanner stage 4. Pubic hair occurs after the breast buds first develop, and for females, the pubertal growth spurt occurs between stages 2 and 3 rather than stages 3 to 4 in males. So these are the Tanner stages, so for females and males. So for males, it's kind of focused around testicular enlargement and the pubic hair, whereas in the females, looking at breast development as well as pubic hair, so for both. Yeah, and then again, just to reiterate the timelines for males, this is an important example. The pubertal growth spurt occurs between stages 3 to 4 and is completed by stage 5, whereas in females, it's in stages 2 to 3, and these are the timelines that are quite specifically asked sometimes. So 2 years before menarche is thelarche, and then the onset of pubic hair occurs after the breast bud. So Winnicott, he provided a few theories, but the most popular one is in relation to parenting, or in specifically related to mothering. And what he basically says is that there is no need for mothers to be perfect; they just have to be good enough. And I think that holds very true, because essentially the primary purpose of a mother is, apart from alpha function and for essential care, emotional warmth, shelter, food, as long as these things are maintained, the child has quite a good chance of developing in all aspects, and they provide a holding environment for the child. The transitional zone is basically what Winnicott proposed was the place where children develop their understanding of psychological things. So the development psychologically occurs in this zone, which is between fantasy and reality. So they use a lot of imaginative play, imaginative constructs in relation to the way that they interact between themselves and others, peers, but also the environment as well. That's why children have a lot of imaginative play, like use dolls or can imagine people or friends or animals as well. So these are the 4 parenting styles. Or actually, there was 3 originally. So the first 3, so the authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive. But later, uninvolved parenting was added. And that was added by Maccabee and Martin in 1983. And these original 3 styles were proposed by Diana Baumring, who was a psychologist from the 1960s. She actually studied more than 100 children to observe these parenting styles. And she noted that the 4 most important aspects of parenting were disciplinary strategies, warmth and nurturance, communication styles, and expectations of maturity and control. And I put 2 stars next to authoritative parenting because this is the key point to note about parenting styles, is that this is the best style of parenting in the experiment and in this theory. So we'll start from the top, but just to remember, authoritative is the best style. So authoritarian parenting, this is like strict rules and punishment. This is the children are very, very obedient and they will do their homework and they will listen to their parents and they'll be very respectful towards their parents. And there's a lot of focus on kind of rules. And again, the children are quite successful in some regard. They are proficient, they do well at school, but they rank lower in happiness, social competence, and self-esteem. And then the best kind is similar to authoritarian. So this is the authoritative parenting. This is slightly more responsive parenting. They give explanations behind the rules, and the children, the form of interaction is a lot more nurturing than punishing and more supportive. And this results in children that are happy, capable, and successful. Permissive parenting, again, these children, they don't do as well. They experience problems at school with figures of authority, and they rank lower in happiness and self-regulation. And the reason for this is that the children are not disciplined by their parents. They end up having to regulate their own emotions and behavior. And the parents take more of a casual role and they are more like a friend. So they don't really enforce rules, punishment and reward. And this is called permissive parenting, which is not really, does not really seem to have a good outcome. The last one, which is the worst type of parenting, is called uninvolved. So you can imagine that would be the worst type. And this is the lowest level of involvement with poor outcome across all aspects of life. The children don't do well at school, they haven't got good self-esteem, they have low self-control, and they also generally lack competence as well. So Harlow's monkeys, basically Harlow did an experiment where he gave young rhesus monkeys a choice between 2 different mothers. So one of them was made from like a cloth, like a soft cloth, and it didn't have any food with it. And the other mother monkey was made of wire, but had like a baby bottle with food in it. So this is quite a mean experiment. He basically removed these babies from their real monkey mothers, and they put them in like a small area which had these 2 options for mothers, like the wire mother with the food and then the soft mother without the food. And basically they proposed that mothering and this connection attachment was purely based on the instinctive need for food. And that was why there was attachment or bonding between a baby and its mother. And this was actually disproved because the baby monkeys spent more time with the soft cloth mother, option rather than the wire mother, which showed that even though there was food available, they preferred the soft mother, and that is the key part of the experiment, really. So that's just a thing to note. This is quite a key theory, so you may already have read this before, covered it in teaching as well. So attachment theory developed by John Bowlby. John Bowlby, he basically proposed that children attach with people around them because they need to increase their chance of survival, and this is like an evolutionary thing. It comes from like evolutionary development of trying to survive as an animal, and this is part of his attachment theory. He proposed that 1 to 3 month old babies single out primary caregiver, which is usually the mother, but it doesn't have to be, and this is called the principal attachment figure. And there is a bias towards a single figure, which is called monotropy, and it's usually the mother. And this is different from bonding, because bonding refers from the other way around, not from the infant to the mother, but from the mother to the infant. So it's not the same as attachment. And bonding is actually a separate thing which can be developed. He proposed that attachment behavior is stable over lifetime. And this has been shown to be quite true, and usually comes up in romantic relationships. And this is the 6 to 36 month period, so 6 months to 3 years, is the critical period for when attachments form. So any kind of disruption from 6 months to 3 years can really affect the attachment style of the child. And the 3 types of attachment he described are secure, insecure avoidant, and insecure ambivalent. And we'll have a look at those in more detail as well. So the way that he proposed this model was that from birth, they're in this stage of pre-attachment until 6 weeks. So the baby is following the mother with its eyes, is looking at the mother, listening to her voice, but the baby's still comfortable with strangers. So the baby can be passed around with different members of family or to whoever, and it won't start crying because it hasn't yet formed any attachment to a mother or to a primary caregiver. Then in the period of 6 weeks to 6 to 8 months, this stage is called attachment in the making. So the infant becomes more attached to one person or potentially more, and this is the beginning of stranger anxiety. So when the baby is given to a stranger, it will then start crying. So this occurs around 6 weeks to 6 to 8 months, and it will stop crying when returned back to the mother or the primary figure. Clear-cut attachment occurs from 6 to 8 months to 18 to 24 months, so around 6 months to 2 years old. And this is the beginning of the separation anxiety part, where there's preference for certain people again, and will cry when taken away from them. So this is for the mother. So the distinction between attachment in the making is that stranger anxiety starts. So when they're given to a stranger, they start crying. But in clear-cut attachment, they will cry when they're taken away from the mother. So there's a preference for certain people. Then the formation of reciprocal attachment, which occurs from 18 months to 2 years, separation anxiety decreases, and they become less physically clingy, but more emotionally clingy. So they will do things like sulk or maybe behave in a certain way which gets more attention. So they're kind of less kind of clinging onto their mother's leg, but more just like will do things to make their mother stay with them more. And then there's this part of Bowlby's model, which I've just written at the bottom, which is called the internal working model. And this is the belief that the person's worldview is shaped by their attachment experiences. So the way that they interact with other people, with friends, with relationships, with family, whoever, is shaped by some of those attachment experiences. And this leads on to also Mary Ainsworth's attachment theory. So this screenshot picture is taken from her experiment called the Strange Situation Test. And what that test was, you may have seen it before, and if not, you can actually watch it on YouTube if you feel that that may help you remember it. But basically, what happens is, first of all, there's a mum, usually, so a parent and a child, and they're playing together in a room, and then they're happily playing, and then a stranger will join them. So there's 3 of them in the room, like similar to the picture right now. Then after a few moments, the parent will leave the room, and the stranger and the child are alone together. Then the parent will come back. So then there's 3 of them back together. Then the stranger will leave, and then the parent leaves too. So then the child is on its own. And then the stranger returns, and then the parent returns last. So there's this period of them being together, then at some point the stranger and the child are alone, and then the parent will come back as well. So Mary Ainsworth basically divided, there were technically 4 categories, but these are the main 3 categories, so that she found from from this experiment. So what she realized was that 70% of children will behave in this secure attachment style. And this is associated with sensitive and responsive carers, and is determined by the primary caregiver's method of parenting. So in the secure attachment style, the baby will be distressed when the mother leaves, and then will avoid the stranger when they're alone. But if the mother is there, the child is friendly. And they appear to be happy when the mother returns. And if their mother is in view, or they know that they're nearby, they explore the rest of the environment, and they don't feel very uncomfortable. The second type, which is 15% of children, is the ambivalent type. So they will, also known as anxious resistant, they will have intense distress when the mother leaves. So they'll be crying or screaming. And this is a severe separation anxiety. And then also when the stranger comes back in, the infant will show fear and avoid them as well. And then when the mother comes back, the child will go to the mother, but will kind of almost push them away. So they'll be a bit resistant towards them. That's why it's called anxious resistant. And they tend to cry more and explore less generally. So just remember that this one, they have a lot of distress when the mother leaves, and that's one of the criteria. And then they resist their mother when they come back in. Then the last type is anxious avoidant. So they don't show any distress when the mother leaves, and then when the stranger is there, they are fine with them. They don't show any fear, and then they're also not interested when the mother returns to the room. And oddly, the stranger is able to comfort the child to the same degree that the mother can. So there's kind of like this equal almost attachment to a stranger and to their mother. And this is characterized by this anxious avoidance style, which again is 15%. And the fourth category, which is not that common or kind of less viewed, is a mixture of the avoidant and resistant types. So that is the fourth category. So resistant attachment is associated with inconsistent carers, and then avoidant attachment is associated with unresponsive carers. So remember, the secure one is like they're responsive and they're sensitive carers. Anxious resistant is that they are inconsistent, and anxious avoidant is that they are unresponsive. So Mary Main, another psychologist, she proposed that the attachment style you had as a child stays with you throughout life. And actually, Mary Ainsworth did propose this as well, but because the experiment was done with children, this is considered a separate theory. So the types that had secure, so that was 70% of children, which does lead into 70% of adults, I believe, will have autonomous or kind of a secure attachment style. Then the avoidant will become what's known as dismissing, resistant will become preoccupied, and disorganized will become unresolved. However, in popular culture, people do still use, anxious attachment or secure attachment or avoidant directly as from what they had as childhood as well. So again, so we have talked a bit about stranger anxiety, and this generally does start around sort of 6 to 8 months, and the worst part of it occurs between sort of 10 to 18 months. And I think this is also related to their developing of object constancy as well. So stranger anxiety and separation anxiety, important to note when those occur, because that can be a combination. And then again, separation anxiety stops at around age 3. This is an experiment done by Lorenz. So this is again a kind of attachment style theory that was developed. So what happened was Lorenz had these baby geese, so the goslings, and he sometimes in the experiment he would take away the mother of the babies, and would use another moving object and see how the baby geese reacted. And he realized that they develop an attachment for the object, and they basically assume that that is their kind of parent, which is really sad. So this was known as imprinting. And also the geese later, when they mature, they develop a sexual preference for things that look like that object as well. So there is some kind of psychosexual aspect to this as well. And a thing to note is that imprinting is rapid, unreinforced, and it occurs within a clearly defined period, which is the critical period, and it is irreversible. So even after the mother goose is reintroduced, because the baby geese have already imprinted onto the first moving object they've seen, they have developed an attachment for that object and imprinted onto that object. So now we're going to talk about the development of fear in childhood. So within the first year of life, the main fears that are noted are strangers, heights, and separation anxiety. And there is evidence to show that even children from 0 to 1 year old can have some degree of depth perception, and will be able to tell if there's like a sharp drop, or if it's deep water, for example, and they will avoid that. Then in preschool, around age 3 to 4 years, the fears that are experienced are related to being alone, being in the dark, natural disasters. So, for example, I used to be really scared of earthquakes, even though we don't really have earthquakes in England, but I used to think that the cracks in the pavement, if you stood on those, that would cause an earthquake. And so things like earthquakes, thunderstorms, lightning, those things are all kind of scary things when you're in preschool. Again, also imaginary creatures like ghosts and witches. And primary school, around 4 to 12, physical danger, bodily injury and illness, supernatural phenomenon, failure, criticism, and social situations, which is newly developed once they're in that kind of social setting. And then from the beginning, like from an early age until late adolescence, there is a slow, gradual increase in the fear of death, which occurs then again usually after around primary school age, and other things like which relate more to the socioeconomic status of the child, but things like financial hardship, or like difficulties in family life, they can occur later and usually sort of up to around late adolescence. So Binet developed the first IQ test in 1905. So this is quite an old concept, really. But I think the one that was developed after that was the Stanford Binet test, which is then developed now, and we currently use the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is the most common IQ test. And the mental age is the basically like the average age that a person should be able to complete a certain test. So what happens is the test is done and their mental age is divided by their real age. So for example, if your mental age is kind of 20 and then your real age is 10, so 20 divided by 10 and times by 100 would give the IQ. And an IQ of 100 means that you are congruent between your real age and your mental age. And so that is basically like a normal person, an IQ of 100. And then people who are, more advanced than their age would have a higher IQ. This is Raven's progressive matrices. So this is a non-verbal test of general intelligence because it kind of takes away some of the language components that may affect overall intelligence on how it's viewed. So these are things like patterns, and each set of items gets harder each time, and then it keeps going until failure, basically. And then there's different types, which is worth knowing about. So there's the coloured progressive matrices, which are for young children and special groups. The Stanford progressive matrices, which is a normal one, and that's used for everyone between 6 to 80 years old. And then the advanced progressive matrices, which is for above average adolescents and adults. So gender development, sex is assigned at birth. So this is based on the genetic chromosomal, what is born XX or XY, and that is assigned at birth. However, the gender identity is a person's sense of being male or female, which does not always correlate with the assigned sex at birth. And this can be known as gender dysphoria, when the gender does not match the assigned sex. As early as 10 months, infants form kind of stereotypic associations with faces and objects. So typically female faces or typically male faces, and also items that are associated with that, like for example, hair bands or flowers and things that are more feminine. And then at around a year and a half to 2 years, children can label gender groups, so they can say girls or boys, for example. And then most children also develop awareness of their own gender at around a year and a half old. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they declare what they think their gender is or, behave differently. There's actually quite a lot of kind of interaction and interplay of gender roles and typical kind of stereotypical play until actually around 7, I believe. But by 5 to 6, most children have declared their identity as male or female. And there are also societal theories that say, obviously in places where this is more enforced, it may happen earlier as well. And in 15% of people, the gender dysphoria persists into adolescence and can be addressed at a later time. Klein-Levin syndrome is an odd condition which occurs in adolescent boys. It's very rare, but it's characterized by these cycles of periods of time where usually a boy will just sleep a lot and then eat all the time and eat a lot, and become very aggressive and irritable as well, and present with some emotional and behavioral problems. So these symptoms just come on like that. They can last for a few days to a few weeks, and they disappear without treatment. And then there's repeated cycles of this with kind of periods of normal behavior in between. And most of them make a full recovery, and there's not really any kind of specific treatment that's given. Usually they just kind of grow out of it. And I don't actually know what the reason for that syndrome is, but it sounds very interesting and weird. So in human development, in the syllabus, there is a mention of Down syndrome and the genetics for Down syndrome. Now later in molecular genetics, we'll cover the rest of the genetic syndromes, so the other things like Rett syndrome or Turner, all of those kind of things. But because Down syndrome is specifically mentioned in this part of the syllabus, I've included it in this part so that it's kind of more complete in terms of revision. So in terms of genetics, the full trisomy 21 for Down syndrome is a non-disjunction, and so it's not an inherited pattern. So it's not really a genetically inherited, straightforward way of, it's not like autosomal recessive or dominant or X-linked or anything like that. It's a non-disjunction of the chromosomes. So the extra chromosome will come from the mother 88% of the time, and 12% of the time it comes from the father. So these are kind of sporadic, basically, and that can be, the risk is increased by the maternal age, which is outlined below. So age of 35 up to 45, it increases almost tenfold. But essentially, there is no real kind of conceptual way of testing for the possibility apart from the risk factor of age. Then translocation, this is in fact inherited, and this is a balanced translocation, but this only makes up around 2 to 3% of cases. And as said, the majority of cases are non-disjunction, so they are more like random or more sporadic, and not necessarily related to inheritance. And lastly, mosaic style. This is again not inherited, but occurs in 2 to 3% and will occur randomly during cell division at an early developmental stage. So again, the risk of Down syndrome is increased with the increasing maternal age, and there's also increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in Down syndrome. And this is because on chromosome 21, there is a gene that produces amyloid precursor protein, which does build up as the amyloid plaques, which is the picture on the right. And these are part of the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. Important points to note is that the MMSE is not useful in diagnosis for Down syndrome patients that are presenting with memory loss or dementia type symptoms. There are these two specific scales or tests that are used, which are the dementia questionnaire for people with LD, with learning disability, and also the DSDS, which is the dementia scale for Down syndrome. This is a side point, so something called anaclitic depression, which is uncommon, but basically occurs when a child becomes unwell during their childhood, essentially, and they basically have to go into hospital, or they have to be separated from their primary caregivers or family from a short period of time. And they develop this type of depression where, because they're separated, they have lower mood, and something called surrogate mothering, which is kind of representative mother, is useful in anaclitic depression, because that will, once they return back to their family during that period, they won't have a big period of absence without any caregiving. So terminology for adult life. There are some things that are mentioned in EMQs. So pairing, which is the homogamous mate selection, and these are related to these two theories called equity theory and reinforcement theory. So a homogamous mate is somebody who's got the same cultural and socioeconomic background to the person, and essentially it's been postulated that people will try and find mates that have similar backgrounds and cultures to them, and socioeconomic background as well, because they feel that they have the best fit. Equity theory is that individuals consider the cost-benefit ratio for each person in the relationship. So basically, how well do they fit in terms of cost-benefit? And the reinforcement theory is that individuals choose a partner on the basis of reinforcement of attraction with rewards. Midlife transition. This occurs, Levinson postulated that it occurs around between 40 to 45 years old. And the term midlife crisis was coined by Elliot Jaques, and he basically said that this is a period of time where people come to realize their own mortality. They think about their goals that they haven't succeeded in, their unrealized goals. There's biological changes such as the menopause, and other situational and social changes, for example, children leaving home or the breakdown of relationships, and this can all lead to the midlife crisis. And moving on to towards the end of the human development time frame, so there's aging. Memory declines with age, as we know, and also the mass of the brain reduces. There is generalized bone loss, the collagen fibers deteriorate, and the efficacy and efficiency of the organs reduce as well. So there's it's believed that this is an economically vulnerable group, because they are at risk of outliving their financial resources. And the reduced mobility impacts their independence and sociability as well, leading to more incidents of low mood. And the social disengagement theory, this is the theory that with age, society withdraws from older people, and also older people withdraw more from society. So there's kind of an equal pulling away of both parts, where older people want to spend more time, at home and not so much time outside of the home. And society is not really, society is accepting of that, and it kind of disengages as well with the older person. And then the other theory is the social exchange theory, which is that that in essence everything kind of has value, like every activity or productivity that can be completed by an adult human has a value in society. So if you go to work and you can provide a service, you are adding value. And basically this theory is saying that because the elderly have very limited resources that they can exchange for valued resources, they basically lose kind of the ability to kind of engage with society. And within the re-engagement theory, there is an ageist society which almost forces older people to withdraw. So it's kind of like, even if the older person wants to be more sociable, the society almost pushes them away as well. And then selectivity theory is when older people tend to spend more time with people that they are close to, like close family, and they may not necessarily socialize as much outside of the home with other types of people that they would normally. So we can ask, I have some questions for you just to think about. So in which stage do children show the concept of conservation? So you can just answer that on your own, or if you want to private message me your answer. Okay, so just have a think about that. Just make a guess if you don't know. Okay. Yeah, great. Most people are getting that right. So the answer is B, which is the concrete operational stage. Well done. That's good. So that is when they show the concept of conservation, things like the water being poured from a cup into a bowl. When is the critical period according to Bowlby's theory? And some answers for that. Okay, so some people have answered A and some people have answered D. So according to Bowlby's original theory, it's 6 months to 3 years. So 6 to 36 months is the critical period. Yeah, so sorry to those of you who put D, it is the correct time start, so 6 months, but it does actually go up to 36 months for the attachment to be formed. Okay. And when does separation anxiety diminish? So this is the anxiety that occurs between the child and their parent, usually the mother. When does that sort of slow down or stop? Okay, good. So some mixed responses on this one. So this is actually by 3 years as well. So it can take a bit of time for separation anxiety to come down. And remember that they have to have the idea of object constancy has to be fully formed. So they have to know that even if they're not looking at their mother directly, that she still exists. And this happens later after, a couple of years of being alive. So after around 2 to 3, that is formed, and that separation anxiety stops at around 3 years. Okay, so, all right. So again, as usual, I went really fast through that.